She was just a homeless teenager with a notebook full of poems asking strangers for spare change. He was Sir Anthony Hopkins, the Oscar-winning legend, the man behind Hannibal Lecter, a Hollywood icon at the pinnacle of his career. When Lily approached him for $1 outside a small cafe in Los Angeles, something in her eyes made Hopkins pause. After decades of studying human nature through countless roles, he recognized what others had missed: authentic talent hiding in plain sight. "I don't want your money," he told her. "I want to read what's in that notebook." What Hopkins discovered changed both their lives forever. The poems scribbled in that tattered journal weren't just words. They were raw truth that even his years in theater couldn't ignore. His decision that rainy afternoon wasn't charity. It was recognition of a kindred creative spirit. The words she'd been hiding, the voice he helped unleash, and the unlikely bond that transformed them both. This is the story Hollywood never told. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon light softened as clouds gathered over Los Angeles, casting the city in a gentle gray hue that Anthony Hopkins found oddly comforting. He sat alone at his usual corner table at Elena's Café, a small establishment tucked away from the relentless bustle of the city. Here he wasn't Sir Anthony Hopkins, the acclaimed actor with countless accolades. Here he was just Tony, a man who enjoyed his Earl Grey with a splash of milk, served in the same chipped blue mug each time he visited. He wrapped his weathered hands around the warm ceramic, feeling the slight imperfection along the handle, a small crack that Elena refused to acknowledge as a reason for replacement. "It has character," she would say whenever he mentioned it. Perhaps that's why he kept coming back. In this cafe, imperfection wasn't something to be discarded. The steam rose in lazy spirals from his tea as he gazed out the window. At 78, he had achieved everything a man in his profession could hope for. His walls at home bore the weight of golden statues and framed accolades. His name was spoken with reverence in the industry. And yet, as he sat quietly watching pedestrians hurry past outside, a familiar hollowness settled in his chest. What good is recognition? He thought. If you're not sure you've truly made a difference? It was during this moment of introspection that he first noticed her, a slender figure hesitating just outside the cafe window. She couldn't have been more than 16, with a tangle of dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Despite the warm California day, she wore layers. A faded flannel shirt over a thin t-shirt, jeans that had long ago lost their shape. But it wasn't her clothes that caught his attention. It was her posture. There was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself, shoulders square despite their slight frame. She paced briefly outside, clutching something to her chest, a notebook, he realized, before finally pushing open the cafe door. The small bell chimed, earning a quick glance from Elena behind the counter, who then returned to wiping down the espresso machine. The girl didn't look at the menu or approach the counter. Instead, she moved directly toward Hopkins, determination in each step despite the slight tremor in her hands. Up close, her face revealed a complexity that struck him immediately. Eyes too old for her years, yet still holding on to something that refused to be extinguished. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "do you have $1 to spare?" Hopkins studied her, taking in details that others might miss. The careful articulation of her words, devoid of the slurred edges of substance abuse. The cleanliness of her fingernails despite her otherwise disheveled appearance. The way she maintained eye contact, not with defiance but with quiet resolve. This wasn't the desperate plea he'd heard countless times on these streets. This was something else entirely. "Why $1?" he asked, his Welsh accent softening the question. The girl blinked, clearly caught off guard. Most people would simply shake their heads or fish out spare change without a word. No one asked why. "I just need to get through today," she replied after a moment's hesitation. Hopkins nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the notebook clutched against her chest. Its edges were frayed, the cover decorated with small, intricate doodles drawn in ballpoint pen. It was held together with a rubber band that had seen better days. "What's in your notebook?" he asked, gesturing toward it with a gentle nod. The girl's arms tightened around it instinctively. Her eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering across her features. "Nothing important," she said. "Just, words." Hopkins leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of his tea. "Words are never just anything, my dear. They're the most powerful things in the world. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, passed over her face before she carefully rebuilt her walls. "They're just mine," she added, a touch of defiance entering her voice. "As they should be," Hopkins agreed, surprising her again. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "I was about to order another cup of tea. Would you care to join?" "Me? It's rather good here." The invitation hung in the air between them. The girl shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her gaze darting to the door, then to the counter where Elena was now watching them with thinly veiled interest, and finally back to Hopkins. "Why?" she asked plainly. A fair question. Hopkins considered it honestly before answering. "Because you asked for $1, not a handout," he said. "And because you carry words with you when most people can barely be bothered to speak them." She studied him carefully as if trying to decode a puzzle. After what felt like a long moment, she pulled out the chair and sat down, placing her notebook carefully on her lap beneath the table, still within her protective grasp. "I'm Tony," he said simply, intentionally leaving out his last name. She hesitated before responding. "Lily," she finally offered, her voice a bit stronger now. Elena appeared beside their table, eyebrow raised questioningly as she looked between them. "Ah, Elena." Hopkins smiled warmly. "Would you be so kind as to bring another cup of tea for my friend Lily here? And perhaps some of those scones you've been hiding in the back?" Elena's gaze lingered on Lily for a moment before her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, Tony. Coming right up." As Elena walked away, Lily's eyes followed her, then returned to Hopkins, a question forming, but not yet spoken. "You come here often?" she finally asked. "Nearly every Tuesday and Friday for the past 3 years," he replied. "The tea is excellent, but the quiet is what I come for." He paused, studying her face. "And what about you? Do you often approach strangers for dollars?" Lily's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. "Only when I need to." "And today, you need to," he stated rather than asked. "Today I need to," she confirmed. Elena returned with another blue mug, this one intact, and placed it before Lily, along with a small plate containing 2 scones and a generous serving of clotted cream and jam. "Thank you," Lily said softly, her eyes widening slightly at the offering. As she wrapped her fingers around the mug, mirroring Hopkins without realizing it, he noticed a small smudge of ink on her thumb, a writer's mark. He'd seen it countless times on his own hands while working through scripts. "Those words in your notebook," he began carefully. "Did you write them yourself?" Lily took a sip of tea before answering, seeming to savor both the warmth and the moment to consider her response. "Yes," she finally said. "They're mine." "May I ask what kind of words they are? Stories? Thoughts?" Her fingers tapped a gentle rhythm against the mug. "Poetry, mostly. Sometimes song lyrics, depends on the day." Hopkins nodded, understanding perfectly. "Depends on what the day demands of you." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Yeah," she said. "Exactly. That." Outside, the clouds had darkened, and a gentle rain began to fall, tapping a soothing rhythm against the windows. Inside, 2 unlikely companions sat across from each other, one with a lifetime of experiences behind him, the other with untold stories waiting to be heard. Between them, a simple cup of tea and the unspoken understanding that in a world full of noise and hurry, being truly seen is perhaps the rarest gift of all. Lily took a bite of her scone, hunger briefly overwhelming caution. As she chewed, Hopkins noticed how her eyes closed momentarily, the universal tell of someone savoring a pleasure long denied. "You know," he said gently, I'm rather curious about those words of yours. Would you consider sharing one of your poems with me? Lily's guard returned instantly, her hand moving to where her notebook rested beneath the table. They're not really for anyone else. Hopkins nodded in understanding. The most meaningful words often begin that way, but at some point words need to be heard to fulfill their purpose. Their purpose is to keep me sane, she replied, with unexpected candor. Then they've served you well, Hopkins acknowledged, but perhaps they're capable of more than you've asked of them. The rain fell harder now, creating a private symphony around them. In this moment of unexpected connection, Anthony Hopkins found himself genuinely curious about what would happen next. A feeling he hadn't experienced in quite some time, not in scripts or on sets, but in the unfolding narrative of real life. And, as he watched Lily struggle between caution and curiosity, between years of protective instincts and the simple human desire to be understood, he recognized something in her that resonated with his own journey. The belief that art, in whatever form it takes, is not merely an escape, but a way to make sense of the world. What began as a request for $1 had somehow opened a door to something neither of them could yet define. But Hopkins, with decades of understanding human nature through the characters he'd embodied, sensed that whatever lay on the other side of that door might be worth exploring for them both. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows of Elena's café, creating a cocoon of sound that seemed to insulate their small table from the rest of the world. Lily had finished both scones, taking care to savor each bite, her initial wariness giving way to tentative comfort. Hopkins watched her with patience born from years of studying human nature, knowing that trust, like any worthwhile thing, couldn't be rushed. "Have you been in Los Angeles long?" he asked, his voice casual, non-threatening. Lily's fingers traced the rim of her mug, now empty of tea. "Almost 2 years," she answered after a moment's consideration. Hopkins nodded, digesting this information. 2 years on the streets as a young girl. The thought made something in his chest tighten. "And before that?" A shadow passed over her face. "Bakersfield," she said simply, then added, "with my mom and her boyfriend." The way she said boyfriend carried a weight that Hopkins immediately recognized. "Not a happy home, I take it?" he asked gently. Lily's laugh was brief and hollow. "You could say that." She glanced toward the door as if calculating her escape route, then seemed to make a decision. "My mom's boyfriend, Rick. He had certain ideas about how to treat people who lived under his roof." Hopkins remained silent, allowing her the space to continue at her own pace. "At first it was just words, you know, the kind that cut you up inside." Her voice had taken on a distant quality. "Then it got worse. He'd throw things, break things. My mom would just disappear into herself." Lily's fingers unconsciously moved to a small scar near her hairline. "The night I left, he came at me with a beer bottle. I dodged most of it, but..." She shrugged, letting the scar speak for itself. "You were brave to leave," Hopkins said softly. "I wasn't brave," she countered. "I was terrified. But sometimes being terrified in a new place is better than being terrified in a familiar one." Elena approached their table again, this time with a fresh pot of tea. She refilled their cups without a word, but her eyes lingered on Lily with something between concern and understanding. As she walked away, Lily watched her go. "She seems nice," Lily observed. "Elena, she's a remarkable woman. Came here from Guatemala with nothing but determination. Built this place from scratch." Hopkins smiled fondly. "She tolerates me because I tip well and don't overstay my welcome." Lily smiled slightly at this. "And today? Are you overstaying by talking to me?" "On the contrary," Hopkins replied warmly. "Today the welcome has been extended." The tension in Lily's shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. She took a sip of her fresh tea before speaking again. "Most people don't make it this long," she said. "Make what?" "Conversations with me. They give me money to make me go away, or they ignore me completely. Nobody asks questions." Hopkins leaned forward slightly. "Perhaps they should. 2 years is a long time to survive on these streets. How have you managed? Lily's gaze grew more guarded again. I haven't done anything illegal if that's what you're asking. That wasn't my question, but I'm glad to hear it nonetheless. She seemed to gauge his sincerity before continuing. I do odd jobs, helping vendors set up at farmers markets, sometimes cleaning for a couple of shop owners who don't ask too many questions. Her voice dropped slightly. There are shelters, but they're complicated. Too many rules. Too many people with problems bigger than mine. And the notebooks? Hopkins nodded toward the worn journal still clutched protectively in her lap. Where do they come from? For the first time, a genuine smile brightened Lily's face. There's this bookstore on 3rd Street. The owner, Mrs. Chen, lets me sit in the corner and read whenever it rains. One day she gave me a notebook, said I looked like I had something to say. Lily's fingers caressed the cover of her journal. When I fill one up, she gives me another, says it's payment for keeping the classics company. Hopkins felt a rush of gratitude toward this unknown bookstore owner. And how many notebooks have you filled? 7, Lily replied, a hint of pride in her voice. They're hidden in a safe place. That's quite impressive, Hopkins said sincerely. May I ask what you write about? Lily hesitated, her fingers tightening around the notebook. Everything. Nothing. She paused, searching for words. Things I see, people. Sometimes stories I make up about them, sometimes. She trailed off. Sometimes, Hopkins prompted gently. Sometimes what I wish I could say to my mom. Or to myself when I was younger. Her voice had grown so quiet that Hopkins had to lean forward to hear her over the rain. Sometimes they're songs without music. Hopkins nodded, understanding the profound significance of what she was sharing. Words are how we make sense of an often senseless world, he said. They're how we survive when mere survival isn't enough. Something in his words seemed to resonate with Lily. She studied him carefully, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. You write too, she said. Not a question, but a recognition. I interpret the words of others mostly, Hopkins clarified. But yes, I understand the need to capture thoughts on paper, to make sense of the chaos inside and out. A moment of silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. The rain had begun to ease, no longer drumming against the windows but falling in a gentle patter. Lily, Hopkins began carefully, would you consider sharing one of your poems with me? I'd be honored to read your words. The request hung in the air between them. Lily's hands tightened around her notebook, her internal struggle visible in the furrow of her brow. Hopkins waited, making no move to pressure her. Finally, she opened the notebook, flipping through pages filled with neat, compact handwriting. She paused on a page near the middle, staring at it for a long moment before slowly sliding the notebook across the table. This one's from last winter, she said, her voice barely audible. Hopkins accepted the notebook with the reverence it deserved, holding it carefully as he began to read the poem written in precise, deliberate script. Glass City, I press my face against the windows of your lives. A ghost girl with see-through skin, watching you eat dinner, argue, laugh, exist in worlds, made warm by walls. You don't see me. Your eyes slide past like raindrops on glass, finding more important places to land. I've learned the art of vanishing while standing perfectly still. At night, the city becomes a constellation of lit windows, each one a star I'll never reach. I name them anyway. Hope, remember, someday, home. My breath fogs the glass of your world. For a moment I can't see in. For a moment you can't see out. In that clouded space between us, I write my name with my finger, just to remember I have one. Hopkins read the poem twice, then a third time, each word resonating with raw emotion and undeniable talent. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. Lily was watching him intently, her expression a complex mixture of vulnerability and defiance. Lily, he said, his voice thick with emotion, you have a gift, an extraordinary gift. She looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. It's just words. No, Hopkins said firmly. It's truth, and truth, especially one so beautifully expressed, is the rarest thing in this world. He closed the notebook gently and held it out to her. Thank you for sharing this with me. As she reached to take back her notebook, their fingers brushed briefly. Hopkins noticed how her hands, though young, were weathered beyond their years, small calluses and tiny scars telling stories of a hard-fought existence. How many people have read your poetry? He asked. Lily reclaimed her notebook, holding it close once more. Just you, she admitted quietly. The significance of this trust was not lost on Hopkins. He felt the weight of responsibility that came with being allowed into someone's most private thoughts. There are people who spend their entire lives searching for the ability to express what you've captured in those pages, he told her. People who pay thousands of dollars for education, for mentors, for opportunities to develop even a fraction of what comes naturally to you. Lily shook her head, disbelief evident in her expression. It's just how I stay sane. It doesn't mean anything. On the contrary, Hopkins replied, it means everything. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Lily, may I ask you something? She nodded cautiously. If circumstances were different, if you had a safe place to live, proper meal support, what would you want to do with your writing? The question seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, the careful mask she wore slipped, revealing a flicker of long-buried hope before skepticism reclaimed its place. Doesn't matter, she said with a shrug that aimed for nonchalance but fell short. Those aren't my circumstances. Humor an old man, Hopkins pressed gently. If they were? Lily stared into her empty teacup as if reading fortunes in the remaining drops. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a whisper of the passion that surely drove her pen across the pages of her notebooks. I'd want people to hear them. Not just read them, but hear them, as songs, as spoken word. Her words gained momentum as she continued. I'd want someone who feels like a ghost to find them and know they're not alone. That someone else understands what it's like to be invisible. The raw honesty in her answer stirred something in Hopkins, a memory of his own younger self, desperate to be heard, to connect, to matter. He recognized in Lily not just talent, but purpose, the kind that, if nurtured, could create ripples, far beyond what she could imagine in her current circumstances. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, sunlight beginning to break through the clouds. Inside, however, a different kind of illumination was taking place. The recognition of kindred spirits across generations, across experiences, across the vast gulf of circumstance that separated a homeless girl with a notebook from a man who had achieved everything the world defined as success. Hopkins looked at Lily, really looked at her, and saw not a charity case or a good deed for the day, but a brilliant mind trapped in impossible circumstances. And in that moment he made a decision that would alter both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. Lily, he said, his voice gentle but firm with resolve, I believe I can help you, not just with a meal or money for today, but with something more substantial, something that might allow those words of yours to find the audience they deserve. The hope that flickered in her eyes was quickly extinguished by suspicion, a survival mechanism honed by 2 years on the streets and who knew how many years before in that house in Bakersfield. Why would you do that? She asked, the wariness in her voice unmistakable. You don't even know me. I know enough, Hopkins replied, simply. I know talent when I see it, and I know what it's like to need just one person to believe in you when everything else seems impossibly stacked against you. Lily's fingers tightened around her notebook, her lifeline in a world that had offered her little kindness. People always say they want to help, she said quietly. They never do. Hopkins nodded, understanding her skepticism. Then I'll just have to be the exception to prove that particular rule, won't I? The afternoon light had shifted to the golden hue of approaching evening, casting long shadows across Elena's café. The rain had stopped entirely now, leaving the world outside freshly washed and glistening. Inside, the café had emptied of other customers, leaving only Hopkins, Lily, and Elena, who was wiping down tables while casting occasional glances their way. Hopkins leaned forward, his hands clasped, on the table between them. "Lily, I want to help you develop your talent. Not just with encouraging words, but with real opportunity." Lily's posture stiffened immediately. The brief vulnerability she had shown while sharing her poetry vanished, replaced by the protective shell that had kept her alive on the streets. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked, suspicion edging her voice. "It means I have connections, people who could help you shape those words into songs, poems that could be performed, perhaps even published," Hopkins explained, careful to keep his tone measured, factual rather than filled with empty promises. "I know people in the music industry and publishing, people who could mentor you, guide your natural talent." Lily's laugh was short and brittle. "Right. And why would you do that? What's in it for you?" The question was direct, even accusatory, but Hopkins didn't flinch. He'd expected this reaction, welcomed it even. Street smarts had kept her alive, abandoning them now would be foolish. "A fair question," he acknowledged. "The honest answer is both selfish and selfless. Selfishly, I get the satisfaction of helping nurture an exceptional talent. At my age, legacy becomes important, not just what you've accomplished, but what you've helped others accomplish." He paused, making sure she was truly listening. "And selflessly, because your words deserve to be heard, Lily. They're too important to remain hidden in notebooks that only you will ever see." Lily shook her head, pushing her chair back slightly. "People always say they'll help. They never do." The words held the weight of repeated disappointment. "I understand your skepticism," Hopkins said gently. "I would feel the same in your position." "No, you wouldn't," Lily countered, a flash of anger in her eyes. "You have no idea what my position is." Hopkins nodded, accepting the rebuke. "You're right. I apologize." He glanced toward the counter where Elena was now pretending not to listen. "Perhaps there's someone whose judgment you trust more than mine." Lily followed his gaze to Elena, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Elena?" she asked, surprised. Hopkins rose from his chair, gesturing for Lily to wait. He approached the counter, speaking quietly to Elena. The older woman's eyes flicked to Lily several times during their brief conversation. Finally, Elena wiped her hands on her apron and followed Hopkins back to the table. "Elena," Hopkins said, "you seem to know Lily." Elena pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat down, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "She comes by sometimes," she confirmed, her accent thickening her words. "Not always inside, sometimes just outside when it rains." She looked directly at Lily. "I've seen you writing in that notebook, sitting under the awning." Lily's surprise was evident. "I didn't think anyone noticed." Elena's smile was warm but tinged with sadness. "I notice many things, Nina, including when someone hasn't eaten properly in days." She glanced at the empty plate where the scones had been, then back at Hopkins. "What are you proposing, Tony?" Hopkins explained his idea, to help Lily develop her writing, to introduce her to people who could mentor her, to ensure she had a safe place to stay and proper meals while she pursued her talent. Elena listened without interruption, her weathered face giving away nothing. When Hopkins finished, she turned to Lily. "He is a good man," she said simply. "I have known him for years. He does not make promises lightly." Then she turned back to Hopkins, her expression hardening slightly. "But this girl has been through more than you can imagine, Tony. Be careful. If you start this, you must finish it, no halfway help." The warning was clear, and Hopkins nodded his understanding. "I have no intention of offering halfway help, Elena." Elena studied him for a long moment, then gave a single, sharp nod. She reached across the table and took Lily's hand in her own. "This man," she said, gesturing to Hopkins, "is not just anyone. Do you understand?" Lily looked confused. "What do you mean?" Elena sighed, glancing at Hopkins with a mix of exasperation and fondness. "Always so humble." She turned back to Lily. "This is Anthony Hopkins, Sir Anthony Hopkins, the actor." Lily's eyes widened, darting between Elena and Hopkins with disbelief. What? Like Hannibal Lecter, Anthony Hopkins? Hopkins winced slightly but nodded. Among many other roles, yes. Holy shit, Lily whispered, then immediately covered her mouth. Sorry. No need to apologize, Hopkins assured her, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Not the first time I've heard that reaction. Lily sat back in her chair, visibly processing this revelation. So you're famous. In certain circles, Hopkins acknowledged modestly. In all circles, Elena corrected firmly. She looked at Lily again. When he says he knows people who could help, he means it. This is not an empty promise. Lily looked down at her notebook, then back up at Hopkins with new wariness. Is this some kind of publicity stunt? Famous actor saves homeless girl headline? Because I'm not interested in being anyone's charity case. The bluntness of her question didn't offend Hopkins, rather it increased his respect for her. I haven't spoken to the press in months, he said, and I have no intention of starting now. This would be between us, and whoever we brought in to help develop your talent. He leaned forward slightly. This isn't about charity, Lily, it's about potential. About ensuring a voice like yours isn't lost. Elena squeezed Lily's hand once more before releasing it. Think about it, Nina. Not all hands that reach out want to take something from you. She stood up, straightening her apron. I have a small room above the cafe. Clean, private. You could stay there tonight, think about Tony's offer without the pressure of the street. Lily looked startled by the suggestion. I couldn't. You can, Elena interrupted firmly. It's sitting empty. Has been for months since my nephew moved out. One night, no strings. The simultaneous offers, one immediate, one potential, seemed to overwhelm Lily. She clutched her notebook tighter, her knuckles whitening. Hopkins recognized the signs of someone on the verge of fleeing. Too much, too fast. Perhaps we should give Lily some space to consider, he suggested gently. Elena nodded in agreement. I'll be in the kitchen. Take your time. She touched Lily's shoulder briefly before walking away. When they were alone again, Hopkins spoke softly. I understand. This is a lot to process. Trust doesn't come easily, nor should it. Lily's gaze was fixed on the table, her thoughts clearly racing behind her carefully composed expression. Why me? She finally asked, looking up at him. Why not some other homeless kid with a notebook? The question hit at the heart of the matter, and Hopkins took his time answering. Because in all my years of reading scripts, working with writers, listening to lyrics, I've rarely encountered words with the raw truth I found in your poem. He gestured to her notebook. What you have can't be taught, Lily. It can be refined, directed, amplified. But that core talent, that honest voice, that's innate. And it would be a tragedy to let it remain unheard. He paused, then added more quietly. And because I saw something of myself in you. Not the talent, though I wish. I had your gift with words, but the need to make sense of a world that hasn't always made sense to you. To transform pain into something meaningful. Lily studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his for any sign of insincerity. I don't know how to trust this, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It doesn't seem real. I understand, Hopkins nodded. So let's start small, one step at a time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. This has my personal number. Not an assistant or agent, me. Lily picked up the card cautiously, studying the simple, elegant typeface. Tonight, consider Elena's offer of a safe place to sleep, Hopkins continued. Tomorrow, if you're willing, we could meet here again, just to talk more, no commitments yet. Lily ran her thumb over the embossed lettering on the card. And if I don't show up? Then that's your choice and I'll respect it, Hopkins replied honestly. But I hope you will. The cafe had grown quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long, golden beams across their table. Outside, the street was coming back to life after the rain, pedestrians emerging from doorways, continuing their journeys. Lily slipped the card into her notebook, closing it carefully. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Not a yes, but not a no either. Hopkins nodded, accepting this as the most he could hope for at present. "That's all I ask." Elena returned from the kitchen, setting a small paper bag on the table. "Some sandwiches," she explained with a shrug. "In case you get hungry later." Her gaze shifted between them. "Have you decided?" Lily hesitated, then nodded slightly. "I'll stay, just for tonight." Relief flickered across Elena's face. "Good, very good." She turned to Hopkins. "And you, Tony? More tea before you go?" Hopkins shook his head, rising from his chair. "No thank you, Elena. I think I've taken up enough of everyone's time for one day." He turned to Lily, careful not to tower over her. "Until tomorrow, perhaps?" Lily clutched her notebook to her chest, a gesture Hopkins had come to recognize as her seeking comfort from the one constant in her life. "Maybe," she said, but her eyes held less suspicion than before. As Hopkins prepared to leave, he felt a curious mixture of hope and trepidation. What he was undertaking was no small thing. Not a casual act of charity, but a genuine commitment to helping reshape a young life. Elena's warning echoed in his mind. "If you start this, you must finish it. No halfway help." He had no intention of offering halfway help, but he also knew that the road ahead would not be simple. Trust once broken is not easily rebuilt, and Lily's trust had clearly been shattered many times over. At the door, he turned back for one last look. Lily was still seated at the table, Elena now beside her, speaking in low, gentle tones. The scene stirred something in Hopkins, a memory of his own younger self desperately in need of someone who believed in him when he couldn't yet believe in himself. As he stepped out into the freshly washed streets of Los Angeles, Anthony Hopkins made a silent promise not just to Lily but to himself. This would not be a fleeting act of kindness quickly forgotten. This would be a commitment however long it took to help a remarkable young voice find its rightful audience. Whether Lily would allow him to keep that promise remained to be seen. But for now, he had planted a seed of possibility in soil that had known little but hardship. And sometimes, he thought as he walked away from Elena's café, that first seed is all it takes for something remarkable to begin growing. The following morning dawned clear and bright, the previous day's rain leaving behind a rare clarity to the Los Angeles air. Hopkins arrived at Elena's café earlier than the agreed time, uncertainty gnawing at him. Would Lily still be there? Or would she have disappeared into the sprawling city, his card and offer forgotten? Elena greeted him with a knowing smile. "She's still here," she said before he could ask. "Upstairs, slept like she hadn't rested properly in months." She poured him his usual tea, which she probably hasn't. Relief washed over Hopkins. "Thank you, Elena, for everything." She waved away his gratitude. "I've been wanting to help that girl for months. Never knew how." Her expression grew serious. "She was writing when I checked on her this morning. Wouldn't even look up." Hopkins nodded, understanding. "When inspiration strikes, you have to capture it. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." 15 minutes later, Lily descended the narrow staircase at the back of the cafe. She looked different, not dramatically so, but noticeably. Her hair was damp from a shower, her clothes the same but somehow neater. The dark circles under her eyes had faded slightly. But the most significant change was in how she carried herself. Still cautious, but with a hint of something new. Possibility, perhaps. She spotted Hopkins and hesitated briefly before approaching his table. "You came back," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "I said I would," Hopkins replied simply. Lily nodded, sliding into the chair across from him. Her notebook was clutched in her hands as always. "I wrote 3 poems last night," she said without preamble. "I couldn't stop. It was like having a real bed and not worrying about someone stealing my stuff while I slept. It unlocked something. Hopkins smiled, delighted by this revelation. That's how it should be. Creativity flourishes when basic needs are met. Elena appeared with a plate of eggs and toast, setting it in front of Lily. Eat, she instructed, then talk. Lily didn't need to be told twice. She ate with the deliberate appreciation of someone who knew hunger too well, savoring each bite. When she finished, she looked up at Hopkins expectantly. "What happens now?" she asked directly. "Now," Hopkins said, "I'd like to introduce you to someone who might help you feel more comfortable with what I'm proposing." He leaned forward slightly. "Lily, do you trust me enough to meet a friend of mine today?" She studied him for a moment. "What kind of friend?" "Someone who understands both worlds, yours and the one I'm suggesting you might enter," Hopkins explained. "A musician. Someone who might be able to help you see the bridge between where you are and where you could be." Lily considered this, then nodded cautiously. "Okay, but I keep my notebook with me the whole time." "Of course," Hopkins agreed readily. 30 minutes later, they were walking through Grand Park, the morning sun warming the pathways. Hopkins had explained that his friend Marcus often played here on weekday mornings when the crowds were thinner, but the acoustics still carried across the open space. They found him near the fountain, a tall, lean black man in his 50s with silver-streaked dreadlocks tied back neatly. He sat on a folding stool, a battered guitar case open at his feet containing a scattering of dollar bills and coins. His fingers moved expertly across the strings of an acoustic guitar that had clearly seen decades of use, coaxing out a haunting blues melody. Hopkins stopped a respectful distance away, allowing Marcus to finish his song. When the last note faded, a small group of onlookers applauded before continuing on their way. Only then did Hopkins approach, Lily hanging back slightly behind him. "Marcus," Hopkins called warmly. "Playing beautifully as always." Marcus looked up, recognition lighting his weathered face. "Tony!" he exclaimed, setting his guitar carefully against his stool and rising to embrace Hopkins. "Been a while, man." "What, 3 months?" "At least," Hopkins agreed. "You're looking well." Marcus laughed, gesturing to his simple attire, worn jeans and a faded denim shirt. "Looking like a man who makes his living on street corners, you mean?" "A man who makes his living with extraordinary talent," Hopkins corrected gently. Marcus's gaze shifted to Lily, who stood awkwardly a few steps back. "And who's this?" Hopkins turned, extending a hand toward Lily. "This is Lily, a new friend with an exceptional gift for words. Lily, this is Marcus Jefferson." Recognition flashed in Marcus's eyes so briefly that Hopkins might have missed it if he hadn't been watching carefully. "Lily," Marcus repeated. "I've seen you around. Broadway and Third sometimes. You're always writing in that notebook." Lily's surprise was evident. "You've seen me," Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "Street folks notice each other, kid. It's how we stay safe." He gestured to her notebook. "Never knew what you were writing, though." "Poetry," Hopkins supplied. "Lyrics, extraordinary ones." Marcus raised an eyebrow, looking at Lily with new interest. "Yeah? You mind if I hear some?" Lily clutched her notebook tighter. I don't really share them." "She shared one with me yesterday," Hopkins explained. "Her first time showing anyone." Understanding crossed Marcus's face. "I get it. First audience is always the hardest." He picked up his guitar again, settling back on his stool. "How about this? You don't have to show me anything. But would you mind if I play while you and Tony talk? Might make things less awkward." The suggestion seemed to ease some of Lily's tension. She nodded, and Marcus began to play again, a gentler melody this time that created a soundtrack to their conversation without overwhelming it. Hopkins guided Lily to a nearby bench. "Marcus has an interesting story," he said once they were seated. "Would you like to hear it?" Lily nodded, her eyes still on the musician. "Marcus was once one of the most sought-after session guitarists in the industry," Hopkins explained. "Played on dozens of gold records in the 90s and early 2000s. toured with names you'd recognize immediately. Lily looked skeptical. Then why is he playing in a park? Marcus, overhearing, laughed without pausing his playing. Good question, kid. Short answer? Mistakes were made. Drugs, bad contracts, worse friends. His fingers never faltered on the strings despite the difficult admission. Lost it all. Been rebuilding one day at a time for about 7 years now. Marcus has been sober for 7 years, Hopkins added quietly. And he's helped many young musicians navigate the industry without falling into the same traps. Marcus nodded, his expression growing more serious. Tony tells me you've got something special, Lily. Words that need to be heard. Lily shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. I just write what I feel. That's where all the good stuff comes from, Marcus replied. The real stuff, anyway. He shifted into a minor key, the melody becoming more contemplative. You know, I meet a lot of kids with expensive equipment, fancy educations, industry, connections. What most of them lack is something real to say. His gaze met Lily's directly. Sounds like you've got the hardest part already figured out. For the first time, Lily seemed truly interested rather than merely cautious. But how do you know if what you're saying matters to anyone else? Marcus smiled. You don't. Not until you say it. That's the leap of faith. He looked at Hopkins. What exactly are you proposing for our young poet here, Tony? Hopkins explained his idea, to help Lily develop her writing, to provide the stability and mentorship she needed, to eventually help her find platforms for her voice. Marcus listened thoughtfully, then looked at Lily. And what do you think about all this? Lily hesitated. It seems impossible, like something that happens to other people. I felt that way once, Marcus said, when I was 16 playing a pawnshop guitar in my grandmother's garage in South Central, and a producer heard me and offered me my first session gig. He shook his head, remembering. Didn't believe it was real until I was sitting in that studio, headphones on, playing alongside people I'd only heard on the radio. His words clearly resonated with Lily. She leaned forward slightly. What was it like? The first time in a real studio? Marcus's face lit up at the memory. Terrifying. Exhilarating. Like standing on the edge of a cliff and jumping off only to discover you could fly. He strummed a triumphant chord. Nothing's ever matched it, kid. Not even the big tours or gold records. Hopkins watched their exchange with quiet satisfaction. This was what he'd hoped for. Someone who could speak to Lily from a place of shared experience, who understood both the promise and the perils of the creative world. Lily, Hopkins said gently, would you be willing to visit a studio? Just to see. No pressure to perform or share your work if you're not ready. Lily's hesitation was visible, but so was her curiosity. Just to see? Just to see, Hopkins confirmed. Marcus played a few more notes before adding, I could come too if that would make you more comfortable. Been a while since I've been in a proper studio. The offer seemed to tip the scales. Lily nodded slowly. Okay, just to look. Hopkins exchanged a glance with Marcus. A silent thank you passing between them. 2 hours later, Hopkins's driver pulled up outside a nondescript building in Burbank. From the outside, Crescent Moon Studios gave no indication of the state-of-the-art facility within. Hopkins had chosen it specifically for its low-key appearance and the discretion of its owner, Daniel Gray. As they approached the entrance, Lily hung back, uncertainty clouding her face. I don't belong here, she whispered. Marcus, walking beside her, replied quietly, None of us belong anywhere until we decide we do, kid. The studio's reception area was understated but elegant. Warm wood tones, comfortable seating, platinum and gold records adorning the walls in simple frames. A receptionist greeted Hopkins by name, her professional smile revealing nothing about the unusual group he'd brought with him. Mr. Gray is expecting you, she said, rising to lead them down a hallway. Daniel Gray met them at the door to Studio B, a compact man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and shrewd eyes behind fashionable glasses. He greeted Hopkins warmly before his gaze traveled curiously to Marcus and Lily. "Tony," he said. "Been too long." His eyes widened slightly as he recognized Marcus. "Jefferson? Marcus Jefferson? Man, I haven't seen you in what, 10 years? "Closer to 12, Marcus replied, extending his hand. "Good to see you, Dan." Gray shook his hand, genuine pleasure in his expression. "You're looking good. Really good." He turned his attention to Lily, who stood slightly behind Hopkins, clutching her notebook like a shield. "And this must be the young talent you mentioned, Tony." "This is Lily," Hopkins confirmed. "We're just here to observe today, Daniel." A gentle introduction. Gray nodded, though Hopkins didn't miss the skepticism that briefly crossed his face. Daniel Gray was a businessman first, and Hopkins knew he was mentally calculating the value of this favor to an old friend. "Of course," Gray said smoothly. "We've got a session wrapping up. You're welcome to observe from the control room." He led them through to a high-tech space dominated by an enormous mixing console. Through a large window they could see a recording booth where a young man was laying down vocal tracks for what sounded like a pop ballad. Lily's eyes widened as she took in the equipment, the soundproofing, the professional environment that had created countless hit records. She moved closer to the window, watching the singer with undisguised fascination. Gray explained the recording process to her in simplified terms. The layers of tracks, the mixing, the production elements. Lily listened intently, asking surprisingly technical questions that made Gray reassess her with newfound interest. "You seem to know something about music production," he observed. Lily shrugged. "I watch YouTube tutorials at the library sometimes, when they let me stay." The session concluded, and the singer departed with barely a glance at the observers in the control room. Gray's assistant engineer followed, leaving them alone in the studio. "Would you like to see the booth?" Gray asked Lily. She nodded, following him into the recording space. Hopkins and Marcus hung back, watching through the window, as Gray showed her the microphones, the headphones, the isolation panels. "She's soaking it all in," Marcus observed quietly. "Like a sponge." "Yes," Hopkins agreed. "I thought she might." Inside the booth, Gray was explaining something about microphone technique when he paused, noticing Lily's notebook. "Are those your lyrics?" he asked. Lily nodded, clutching the notebook tighter. "May I see?" Gray extended his hand. Lily hesitated, looking through the window at Hopkins, who gave her an encouraging nod. Slowly, she opened the notebook to the poem Hopkins had read, handing it over with visible reluctance. Gray read it silently, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he looked up at Lily with new interest. "Did you write this?" "Yes," she said simply. "It's good," Gray said, handing back the notebook. "Really good, actually. Raw, but that can be refined." He gestured to the microphone. "Do you have music for it, or is it spoken word?" Sometimes I hear melodies when I write," Lily admitted. "But I've never tried to actually sing them for anyone." Gray glanced through the window at Hopkins and Marcus, then back to Lily. "Would you like to try, just to see how it feels in a real booth? No recording, just exploration." Panic flashed across Lily's face. She backed away from the microphone, shaking her head. "I can't. I'm sorry. I thought I could, but I can't." Hopkins immediately entered the booth, moving to Lily's side. "It's all right," he said gently. "No pressure. This is just a first visit." Gray looked disappointed but nodded. "Of course. Maybe another time." Lily's breathing had quickened, her knuckles white around her notebook. Hopkins recognized the signs of fight or flight. Response: "Too much, too fast. Perhaps we should go," he suggested. But Marcus, who had followed Hopkins into the booth, had a different approach. He picked up an acoustic guitar that had been left on a stand in the corner. "Mind if I play this, Dan?" he asked. Gray shrugged. "Be my guest." Marcus sat on a stool near Lily, not crowding her but creating a small island of familiarity in the intimidating space. He began to play. Not a song, just gentle chords, creating a soothing background. "You know, Lily," he said conversationally, As he played, "First time I was in a studio, I threw up in the bathroom beforehand. Was so nervous I could barely hold my pick." A tiny smile flickered at the corner of Lily's mouth. "Really?" "Really," Marcus confirmed. "Thought for sure they'd kick me out, tell me I didn't belong there." His fingers moved effortlessly across the strings. "But then I started playing and everything else just fell away. It was just me and the music." He shifted into a simple, repeating chord progression. Nothing complex, just a gentle foundation. "No pressure," he said softly. "But if you wanted to just try your words with this, we're the only ones listening. And we're already on your side." Hopkins watched as Lily wavered, conflict evident in every line of her body. "When you're ready, the world will listen," he said quietly. "And if you're not ready today, that's perfectly all right too." Gray, to his credit, moved away toward the control room, giving her space. "I'll step out," he said. "Just signal if you want me to come back." Left alone with just Hopkins and Marcus, Lily's breathing gradually steadied. She opened her notebook to a different page than the one she'd shown before. For a long moment she just stood there, reading her own words silently. Then, almost imperceptibly, she began to sway slightly with the rhythm of Marcus's playing. Her lips moved soundlessly at first, rehearsing words only she could see. Marcus continued playing, never pushing, just providing a steady foundation. Hopkins remained perfectly still, afraid that the slightest movement might shatter the delicate moment. And then, so softly it was almost inaudible, Lily began to sing. "Invisible girl with paper skin, walking through walls no one lets me in. Counting, stars I'll never touch, dreaming dreams that cost too much." Her voice strengthened with each line, a haunting alto with unexpected depth and control. There was no polish to it, no trained technique, but it carried something far more valuable. Raw, unfiltered emotion that made the simple words soar. Marcus adjusted his playing to follow her natural rhythm, supporting without leading. The transformation was remarkable, Lily's habitual guardedness melting away as she lost herself in her own creation. Through the control room window, Hopkins could see that Gray had returned and was listening intently, his expression shifting from polite interest to genuine surprise. The song, for it truly was a song, not just a poem set to music, spoke of invisible people, of city lights that burned too bright, of finding beauty in broken things. It was both deeply personal and universally accessible, the mark of truly effective writing. When Lily finished, the final notes hanging in the air like suspended crystals, there was a moment of profound silence. She looked up, suddenly self-conscious again, her vulnerability quickly retreating behind familiar walls. "That was..." Hopkins began, but found himself at a rare loss for words. "Damn," Marcus said simply, setting down the guitar. "That was the real thing, kid." Gray's voice came through the control room speaker. "Lily, would you mind if I came back in?" She nodded hesitantly, and Gray entered the booth, his professional detachment noticeably thinner. "That was unexpected," he said, studying Lily with new eyes. "Have you had any vocal training?" She shook her head. "No." "Remarkable," Gray murmured. "The phrasing, the emotional control." He glanced at Hopkins. "Tony, could I have a word?" As they stepped into the hallway, Gray's demeanor shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement. "Where did you find her? And what exactly are you planning to do?" Hopkins explained the circumstances of their meeting, his desire to help Lily develop her talent, to provide her with stability and opportunity. Gray nodded thoughtfully. "She's rough, obviously, needs technical development, professional guidance." He paused. "But there's something there, Tony. Something real. I've heard thousands of singers, read countless lyrics. What she has, you can't teach that." "I know," Hopkins agreed quietly. "What does she need most right now?" Gray asked pragmatically. "Stability, safety, belief." Hopkins didn't hesitate. "She's been homeless for 2 years, Daniel. Before that, an abusive home. She needs time and space to heal while she develops her gift." Gray considered this. I might be able to help with that. We have an artist residency program, meant for established artists, but we make exceptions. He shrugged. Board owes me after the profits from that boy band last quarter. Hope sparked, in Hopkins. You think she'd qualify? After what I just heard? With your recommendation? Yes, Gray's expression grew serious. But Tony, you need to be sure about this. These kids with rough backgrounds, they can be unpredictable. There will be setbacks. I'm aware, Hopkins replied. I'm committed to seeing this through, whatever it takes. Gray studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, let me make some calls. We could have something arranged within a week or two. When they returned to the booth, they found Marcus showing Lily different chord progressions on the guitar, her attention completely absorbed by the lesson. Something about the scene, the established musician sharing knowledge with the promising novice, struck Hopkins as perfectly right. Gray approached them. Lily, I'd like to offer you something if you're interested. We have a program that provides housing, studio time, and mentorship for developing artists. It would give you a safe place to live while you work on your music. Lily froze, her expression immediately suspicious. Why would you do that? You just met me. Gray's answer was refreshingly honest. Because what you just did happens maybe once or twice in a decade, and when it does, people in my position pay attention. He shrugged. Also, Tony here is a friend of long standing. His judgment matters to me. Lily looked at Hopkins, uncertainty in her eyes. Is this real? Hopkins nodded. It's real, Lily. A genuine opportunity, if you want it. You don't have to decide right now, Marcus added. Take some time to think about it. Lily looked down at her notebook, then around the studio, a world so far removed from the streets where she'd been surviving. Her hand trembled slightly as she closed the notebook. I need to think, she said quietly. Of course, Hopkins assured her. All of this will still be here when you're ready. As they prepared to leave, Gray handed Lily his card. Whenever you decide, call me directly. And Lily? He waited until she met his gaze. What you have is special. Don't let fear keep you from exploring it. In the car ride back to Elena's cafe, Lily was quiet, processing the events of the day. Hopkins and Marcus respected her silence, allowing her the space to absorb what had happened. When they arrived, Marcus squeezed Lily's shoulder gently. You did good today, kid. Really good. Lily managed a small smile. Thanks for being there. It helped. As Marcus stepped out of the car, Hopkins turned to Lily. Whatever you decide, I want you to know how proud I am of your courage today. Lily looked up at him, her expression a complex mixture of hope and fear. What if I try this and fail? What if I'm not good enough? Then you'll have learned something valuable, Hopkins replied. But from what I heard today, what we all heard, I don't think that's going to be the outcome. Lily clutched her notebook, her lifeline in an uncertain world. I've never had anyone believe in me before, she said softly. It's terrifying. Hopkins nodded in understanding. Sometimes being seen for who you truly are is the most frightening thing of all. But it's also the beginning of becoming that person fully. As Lily stepped out of the car, notebook held tight against her chest, Hopkins watched her walk into Elena's cafe. The girl who had asked him for $1 just yesterday was taking her first tentative steps toward a future none of them could have imagined. Whether she would embrace that future remained to be seen. But a door had been opened, and for the first time Lily was allowing herself to peek through it, to glimpse the possibilities that lay beyond. 1 week after her first visit to the studio, Lily stood frozen in the doorway of her new apartment. The space was modest by most standards. A studio with a small kitchen area, a bathroom with an actual tub, and a living area that doubled as a bedroom. But to someone who had been sleeping in shelters and doorways for 2 years, it might as well have been a mansion. This is all mine? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel Gray, who had personally overseen the arrangements for her artist residency, nodded. Part of the program. Yours for at least 6 months with the option to extend based on your progress. Lily took a tentative step inside, her worn backpack containing everything she owned clutched tightly in one hand, her notebook in the other. The apartment was simply furnished but comfortable. A full-sized bed with clean linens, a small desk by the window, a comfortable chair, a bookshelf already stocked with poetry collections and songwriting references. A basic acoustic guitar stood on a stand in the corner. "The guitar is from Marcus," Gray explained, following her gaze. "Said you'd need it to work on your songs." Lily approached it cautiously, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her fingers brushed the smooth wood, tracing the curve of its body. "I don't know how to play," she admitted. "That's what the lessons are for," Gray replied pragmatically. He set a folder on the small dining table. "Everything's in here. Schedule for your sessions, emergency contacts, building information. The kitchen's stocked with basics. There's a stipend card for groceries and necessities." He hesitated, then added more gently, "This is real, Lily. It's not going to vanish." But as Gray left her alone in the apartment, that was exactly what Lily feared. Standing in the middle of the silent room, surrounded by more security than she'd known in years, she felt a rising panic rather than relief. This wasn't her world. This was a mistake. A cruel joke that would be snatched away just as she began to believe in it. She sat on the edge of the bed, its softness foreign and unsettling after years of hard surfaces. The quiet was oppressive after the constant noise of the streets. Even the clean smell of the place felt wrong, lacking the urban grit she'd grown accustomed to. Lily opened her notebook, seeking comfort in its familiar pages. But for the first time in years, no words came. The blank page stared back at her accusingly. "I don't belong here," she whispered to the empty room. That night, she slept on the floor beside the bed, unable to surrender to the comfort that felt so unearned, so precarious. The following morning brought her first scheduled session, a voice lesson with a vocal coach named Sophia Reeves, a former opera singer who now specialized in developing young talent. Hopkins had arranged the meeting, assuring Lily that Sophia's approach would be gentle and supportive. The studio was different from Gray's, smaller, more intimate, designed for instruction rather than recording. Sophia greeted Lily warmly, her keen eyes taking in Lily's tense posture and wary expression. "Anthony has told me about your natural talent," Sophia said, her voice melodious even in speech. "I'm looking forward to helping you develop it." The session began simply enough, with breathing exercises and basic vocal warm-ups. Lily followed along hesitantly, acutely aware of how out of place she felt. Every time Sophia corrected her technique or suggested an adjustment, Lily's internal criticism grew louder. "You don't belong here. These people are professionals. They'll realize you're a fraud." As they moved into more complex exercises, Sophia asked Lily to perform one of her original pieces. "Just so I can get a sense of your natural style," she explained. Lily opened her notebook to a recent poem, one she'd written during her first night at Elena's. But as she began to sing, something felt wrong. The words that had flowed so naturally in the recording booth with Marcus now felt stilted, self-conscious. Her voice wavered, catching in her throat. Sophia stopped her gently. "Let's try a different approach. Sometimes when we're learning technique, it can interfere with our natural expression. Let's go back to basics." But Lily heard only failure in the gentle correction. The voice in her head grew louder, drowning out Sophia's encouragement. "See? You can't even do this right. They're going to realize they've wasted their time and money." Halfway through the lesson, as Sophia was demonstrating a particular technique for sustaining notes, Lily abruptly closed her notebook. "I can't do this," she said, her voice tight with frustration and fear. "I'm sorry for wasting your time." Before Sophia could respond, Lily was out the door, her footsteps quick on the stairs. She burst onto the street, gulping the cool air, her heart hammering against her ribs. Without conscious thought, her feet carried her in a familiar direction, away from the studio, away from the apartment that didn't feel like hers, away from opportunities that felt like traps. She walked for hours, the comfort of anonymity on the streets wrapping around her like an old, familiar blanket. This, she understood. This was real. The other world, Hopkins' world, with its studios and apartments and people who believed in her, that was the illusion. As evening fell, Lily found herself outside Elena's café. The lights were still on inside, the familiar warmth beckoning. She hesitated, then sat on the bench outside, not quite ready to go in, not quite ready to run away either. That was where Hopkins found her an hour later, hunched against the cooling night air, her notebook open but empty in her lap. "Sophia called me," he said simply, sitting beside her on the bench. "Said you left rather suddenly." Lily didn't look up. "I shouldn't have gone in the first place." "Why not?" "Because it's not real," she burst out, finally meeting his gaze. "None of it is. People like me don't get apartments and music lessons and second chances. We get shelters and handouts and pitying looks." Hopkins was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Do you know when I started drinking heavily?" he asked, the abrupt change of subject catching her off guard. She shook her head. "I was in my 30s, already somewhat successful in my career. I should have been happy, grateful. Instead, I was plagued by doubt, convinced I was a fraud who would be exposed at any moment." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "So I drank. To quiet the voices, to numb the fear." Lily watched him carefully, surprised by this sudden vulnerability from a man she'd only known as composed and confident. "It got worse before it got better," Hopkins continued. "There were blackouts, missed opportunities, relationships damaged beyond repair." He looked at her directly. "The point is, Lily, I understand what it's like to sabotage yourself because some part of you believes you don't deserve success or happiness." "It's not the same," Lily argued. "You were already somebody. I'm nobody. We're all somebody," Hopkins countered gently. "And we're all nobody. The difference is merely in what opportunities we're given and what we do with them." He shifted to face her more directly. "Your fear isn't unusual, Lily. In fact, it's remarkably common. Do you know what separates those who succeed from those who don't? It isn't talent. There are countless talented people who never achieve anything of note." "What is it then?" Lily asked softly. "Persistence," Hopkins replied. "The willingness to continue despite the doubt. The doubt will always be there, Lily. It's not about making it disappear. It's about pushing forward in spite of it." Lily closed her notebook, her fingers tracing the worn cover. "What if I try and fail? What if this is all just a waste of everyone's time and money? Then you'll have failed while trying something extraordinary, rather than succeeding at staying safe." Hopkins's voice was gentle but firm, and that, I assure you, is no failure at all. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the evening traffic passing by, the cafe's lights creating a pool of warmth around them. "When I was lost in alcohol," Hopkins finally said, "someone believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. They saw what I could be, not what I was in my worst moments." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "That's all I'm doing for you, Lily, seeing what could be." Lily looked up at him, vulnerability and fear naked in her expression. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "None of us do at first," Hopkins assured her. "We learn by doing it badly, then less badly, then, perhaps eventually, well." As they were speaking, a familiar figure approached. Marcus, his guitar case slung over his shoulder. "Thought I might find you here," he said, taking in the scene. "Rough day?" Lily nodded, unable to put into words the storm of emotions that had driven her from the studio. Marcus set his case down and leaned against the cafe window. "Heard you walked out on Sophia. She's good people, you know. Best vocal coach in the city." "I know," Lily said quietly. "It wasn't about her. It was me. I didn't feel like I belonged there." Marcus nodded in understanding. "Know that feeling. First time I went back into a studio after getting sober. Nearly turned around and walked right back out. Felt like an imposter." "What stopped? You?" Lily asked. knowing that running away from good things won't make it hurt less if they end. Marcus said bluntly. Bad stuff hurts. Good stuff that ends hurts too. Might as well grab the good while it's there. His directness cut through Lily's tangled thoughts. What if I'm not good enough? She asked, giving voice to her deepest fear. Then you're not. Marcus shrugged. So what? Take the shot. If you crash and burn, at least you tried. That's more than most people ever do. The cavalier response startled a laugh out of Lily. That's your pep talk? Marcus grinned. I'm not Tony. I don't do inspirational speeches. I just know that staying safe is overrated. His expression grew more serious. That notebook of yours is full of things that need to be heard, kid, but nobody's going to hear them if you keep running away. The truth of his words settled over Lily. She looked down at her notebook, then back up at these two men who, for reasons she still couldn't fully comprehend, believed in her. I don't know if I can go back, she said honestly. You can, Hopkins assured her. Sophia understands. She's worked with many artists who struggle with these same fears. And if you're worried about the apartment feeling weird, that's normal too, Marcus added. Took me months to get used to having my own place. Again, after living rough, still sleep on the floor sometimes when the bed feels too soft. Lily looked at him in surprise. You do? Marcus nodded. Some habits are hard to break. Doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. For the first time that day, Lily felt something loosen in her chest, the tight knot of fear and inadequacy giving way to a tentative acceptance. These people understood. They didn't expect perfection, they just expected her to try. I could call Sophia, she said hesitantly. See if she'd be willing to reschedule. She already has, Hopkins smiled. Tomorrow morning, if you're willing. Lily took a deep breath, then nodded. I'll be there. That night, back in her apartment, Lily sat at the small desk by the window. The city lights spread out before her, a constellation of lives and stories she'd once observed from the outside. Now, somehow, she was part of it in a new way. She opened her notebook to a fresh page and began to write. The words came slowly, at first, then faster, pouring out in a rush of raw emotion, fear and hope intertwined, the terrifying possibility of change, the vertigo of stepping into the unknown. When she finally went to bed, she still chose the floor, but this time she took a pillow and blanket with her. Small steps, one day at a time. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a gentle light filtering through the simple curtains of Lily's apartment. She woke early, anxiety and determination battling for dominance. Today would be different. Today she would stay no matter how uncomfortable it became. She arrived at Sophia's studio 10 minutes early, her notebook clutched in her hands. Sophia greeted her with a warm smile that held no judgment, no disappointment. I'm sorry about yesterday, Lily began. Sophia shook her head. No apologies needed. This process isn't just about technique, Lily. It's about finding your voice in every sense of the word. That takes courage. The session began much as the previous one had, with breathing, exercises and gentle warm-ups. But this time, when the doubt crept in, and it did, whispering its familiar litany of inadequacy and unworthiness, Lily acknowledged it without surrendering to it. The doubt will always be there. It's not about making it disappear. It's about pushing forward in spite of it. Hopkins's words became a mantra, helping her stay present when everything in her wanted to flee. It wasn't easy. More than once she had to stop, close her eyes, and simply breathe through the overwhelming urge to run. When Sophia asked her to share one of her original pieces again, Lily hesitated, but then opened her notebook to the newest entry, the one she'd written the night before. It's not finished, she warned. That's perfect, Sophia assured her. We can work with that. Lily began to sing, her voice tentative at first, then gradually stronger as she gave herself permission to be imperfect. The song was raw, unpolished, but undeniably authentic, a reflection of her struggle between two worlds, between fear and possibility. When she finished, Sophia was quiet for a moment. That, she finally said, is exactly why Anthony brought you to me. You have something real to say, Lily. My job isn't to change that, but to help you say it in a way that ensures people will listen. For the remainder of the session, they worked on specific techniques to strengthen Lily's natural voice, without sacrificing its unique quality. By the end, Lily was exhausted, but also exhilarated in a way she'd never experienced before. Same. Time on Friday? Sophia asked as Lily prepared to leave. Lily nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I'll be here. Over the following weeks, a tentative routine began to emerge. Mornings with Sophia, working on vocal technique. Afternoons with Marcus, learning the basics of guitar and song structure. Evenings at her apartment, writing and rewriting, gradually filling a new notebook provided by Daniel Gray. There were still bad days. Moments when Lily would stand in her apartment, overwhelmed by the foreignness of stability, the weight of expectations. Days when the old voice would grow so loud that she could barely hear anything else. You don't deserve this. They'll realize their mistake eventually. This isn't your world. But increasingly, there were also good days. Days when a melody would come to her complete and perfect, when her voice would hit a note she'd never reached before, when a lyric would capture exactly what she meant to say. Hopkins visited regularly, never pushing, simply offering his steady presence and unwavering belief. He arranged for her to meet with a therapist specialized in working with young people who had experienced trauma and homelessness. The sessions were difficult, often leaving Lily emotionally drained, but they provided tools for managing the overwhelming feelings that sometimes threatened to drown her. During one of Hopkins' visits, as they shared tea in her gradually more personalized apartment, Lily asked the question that had been lingering in her mind for weeks. Why are you doing all this, really? Hopkins considered the question carefully before answering. When I was younger, he began, lost in addiction and self-doubt, someone saw in me what I couldn't see in myself. They extended a hand when I was drowning, not because I deserved it more than anyone else, but because they were in a position to help and chose to do so. He looked at her directly. In the simplest terms, Lily, I'm passing on what was given to me. Lily nodded, absorbing this. I'm afraid of letting you down, she admitted quietly. The only way you could let me down, Hopkins replied, is if you stopped being true to your own voice. Success isn't measured in record deals or performances, Lily. It's measured in authenticity, in growth, in courage to face each day's challenges. Something in his words resonated deeply with Lily. For the first time, she began to understand that perhaps the expectations she feared weren't coming from Hopkins or Gray or anyone else. They were coming from within, the impossible standards she had set for herself, the belief that she had to be perfect to be worthy. 6 weeks after moving into the apartment, Lily faced her biggest challenge yet. Daniel Gray had arranged for her to record one of her songs professionally, not for release but as a benchmark of her progress, a tangible reminder of how far she had come. The morning of the recording, Lily stood in front of the small mirror, in her bathroom, hardly recognizing herself. The gaunt, hollow-eyed girl who had approached Hopkins for $1 was gone. In her place stood someone still thin but healthier, with clear eyes and a steadier gaze. Her hair, trimmed by Elena during a visit to the café, framed a face that had begun to remember how to smile. She still slept on the floor some nights, still carried her notebook everywhere like a talisman, still sometimes woke in a panic, convinced it had all been a dream. But increasingly, she was beginning to accept that perhaps this new reality wasn't going to vanish overnight. At the studio, she was greeted by the now familiar faces. Gray, professional but encouraging. Sophia, warm and supportive. Marcus offering a casual fist bump and a quiet, "You got this, kid." And Hopkins, whose steady presence had become a cornerstone of her new life. As Lily entered the recording booth, setting her notebook on the music stand and adjusting the headphones, the familiar doubt began its whispered assault. You'll freeze. You'll fail. They'll finally see they were wrong about you. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered Hopkins' words. The doubt will always be there. It's not about making it disappear. It's about pushing forward in spite of it. Opening her eyes, she nodded to Gray in the control room. "I'm ready." The music began, a simple arrangement Marcus had helped her develop for her most complete song, a haunting ballad about invisibility and emergence, about finding a voice after years of silence. As she sang, something extraordinary happened. The doubt didn't disappear, but it receded, becoming background noise rather than a deafening roar. In its place came something Lily had never experienced before, the pure joy of expression, of connecting with her own truth and sharing it without apology or fear. Her voice soared through the lyrics, carrying all the pain of her past and all the tentative hope of her present. When the final note faded, there was silence in her headphones. For a moment, Lily feared the worst, that they were trying to find kind words for a disappointing performance. Then she heard Gray's voice, uncharacteristically emotional. "Lily, that was exceptional, truly exceptional." Looking through the glass, she saw Hopkins wiping a tear from his eye, Sophia beaming with pride, Marcus nodding with a satisfied smile, and Gray looking at her with newfound respect. In that moment, standing in a place that had once felt impossibly foreign, Lily realized something profound. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be complete. The doubt might never fully disappear. The fear of loss, of failure, of unworthiness might always lurk in the shadows of her mind. But for the first time, she could envision a future where those shadows didn't define her, where her voice, literal and metaphorical, could reach beyond the pages of a hidden notebook to touch others who felt as invisible as she once had. It wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about becoming more fully herself, the self that had been buried beneath years of survival and fear and invisibility, the self that had always been there, waiting for the chance to emerge into the light. As Lily stepped out of the booth to a chorus of genuine praise and congratulations, she felt something shift within her. Not a dramatic change, but a subtle realignment, like a dislocated joint finally finding its proper place. The journey wasn't over. There would still be days when the old fears returned, when the new world felt too bright, too exposed, too fragile. But something had fundamentally changed. She had proven to herself that she could face the fear and continue anyway. That the voice of doubt, while persistent, didn't have to have the final word. "What did you think?" Hopkins asked quietly as the others discussed technical aspects of the recording. Lily considered the question, searching for the right words. Finally, she smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm ready for what comes next." And in that simple statement was a universe of progress, a testament to the power of one small act of kindness. A man pausing to truly see a girl who had been invisible for too long, and how that moment had set in motion a transformation that neither of them could have imagined. The Blue Note was a small venue tucked away on a side street in Los Angeles, known for showcasing emerging artists in an intimate setting. Tonight, its warm lighting cast a gentle glow over the gathering crowd. Not a large audience, but a discerning one. Music industry professionals mingled with regular patrons, their quiet conversations creating a gentle hum throughout the space. Backstage, in a small room that served as both dressing room and storage closet, Lily paced back and forth. 3 months had passed since her first recording session. 3 months of intensive work with Sophia on her voice, with Marcus on guitar and composition, with her therapist on managing the anxiety that still sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. 3 months of gradually finding her footing in a world that once seemed impossibly out of reach. But tonight was different. Tonight wasn't a lesson or a practice session. Tonight she would perform 3 of her original songs for a real audience. Strangers who hadn't been coached to be supportive, who didn't know her story, who would judge her solely on the merit of her art. The thought made her stomach clench. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the simple pendant at her throat, a small silver feather that Elena had given her for courage. Her worn notebook lay open on a small table, though she hardly needed to reference it anymore. The words of her songs were etched into her memory, had become part of her. What if they don't like me? She whispered to her reflection in the small spotted mirror. What if I freeze? The door opened quietly, and Hopkins stepped in. In the 3 months since their first encounter, he had become not just a mentor but something closer to family, the first person in her life who had believed in her potential without condition or expectation. 5 minutes, he said gently. How are you feeling? Lily laughed nervously, like I'm going to throw up. Hopkins smiled in understanding. A common pre-performance sensation, I assure you. Even after all these years, I still feel it before stepping onto a stage. You do? Lily looked at him in surprise. The day it stops is the day I should retire, Hopkins replied. It means you care. It means it matters. Lily took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The room's full of industry people. Daniel said some label representatives are out there. What if I'm not ready? What if I'm not good enough? Hopkins moved closer, placing his hands gently on her shoulders, meeting her gaze in the mirror. Lily, listen to me. You don't have to prove anything to anyone out there. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be what they expect or want. Then, what do I have to do? She asked, her voice small. Just tell your story, Hopkins said simply. That's all you've ever needed to do. The story that's been inside you all along, the one you kept safe in that notebook through everything. Tell it honestly, and the right people will hear it. His words seemed to cut through the noise of her anxiety, reaching a quieter place within her. Lily nodded, taking another deep breath. A stage manager knocked on the door. 2 minutes, Miss Lily. Hopkins gave her shoulders a gentle squeeze before releasing them. I'll be right there in the front row with Elena and Marcus. Just find us if you need an anchor. As he turned to leave, Lily called after him. Tony? It was the first time she'd used his first name, a small but significant shift. Thank you. For everything. Hopkins smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Thank me after your standing ovation, he said lightly. And then he was gone, alone again. Lily closed her notebook and held it to her chest for a moment, drawing strength from this object that had been her companion through her darkest days. Then she set it down, straightened her shoulders, and walked toward the stage. The blue note fell silent as Lily stepped into the spotlight. The stage was simple, just a stool, a microphone, and a glass of water on a small table. In the audience, faces turned toward her expectantly. She could make out Hopkins, Elena, and Marcus in the front row. Daniel Gray sat at a small table to the side with several people she didn't recognize. Industry representatives, she presumed. For a long, terrifying moment, Lily stood frozen, the silence pressing against her like a physical weight. The familiar panic began to rise, the urge to turn and flee, to return to invisibility. Then her eyes found Hopkins. He gave her a small, reassuring nod, not pushing, not expecting, simply believing. Beside him, Elena smiled warmly, and Marcus gave her a subtle thumbs up. Lily took a deep breath and stepped forward to the microphone. Hello, she said, her voice barely audible at first. She cleared her throat and tried again. My name is Lily. I'm going to sing some songs I wrote. The simplicity of the introduction reflected her lack of pretense, her raw honesty. She settled onto the stool, adjusting the microphone slightly. Her hands still trembled, but less violently now. This first song is called Glass City. I wrote it last winter. As she began to sing the poem Hopkins had first read in Elena's café, now set to music with Marcus's guidance, her voice started shaky and uncertain. But by the end of the first verse, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear. It simply ceased to matter as much as the story she was telling. I press my face against the windows of your lives, a ghost girl with see-through skin, watching you eat dinner, argue, laugh, exist in worlds made warm by walls. Her voice gained strength, finding its natural power, carrying her words out over the hushed audience. This was the song of her invisibility, of pressing her face against the glass of a world that seemed to exist for others, but not for her. As she moved into the second verse, she dared to look up, to truly see the audience that was listening to her. What she saw startled her. They were listening, really listening, not with polite attention but with genuine engagement. In some faces she saw recognition, the universal experience of feeling unseen, of yearning for connection. At night, the city becomes a constellation of lit windows, each one a star I'll never reach. I name them anyway. Hope, remember, someday home. By the final verse, Lily was no longer performing. She was simply sharing, offering her truth without apology or doubt. Her voice soared through the room, carrying all the loneliness of her past and all the tentative hope of her present. My breath fogs the glass of your world. For a moment I can't see in. For a moment, you can't see out. In that clouded space between us, I write my name with my finger, just to remember I have one. As the last note faded, there was a moment of profound silence, that magical pause that comes when an audience has been truly moved. Then applause erupted, genuine and enthusiastic. Lily blinked in surprise, a small, wondering smile touching her lips. "Thank you," she said softly. "This next song is newer. It's called Invisible Girl." With growing confidence, Lily moved into her second song, the one she had first shared in the recording studio when Marcus played guitar for her. This time, she accompanied herself, her fingers finding the chords Marcus had patiently taught her over the past months. The song told of surviving on the margins, of the strength required to maintain dignity when the world looks through you rather than at you. It spoke to the resilience of the human spirit, to finding beauty in the broken places of life. As she sang, Lily noticed Daniel Gray leaning forward in his seat, his usual professional detachment replaced by genuine interest. The industry representatives at his table were exchanging glances, one of them making notes on a small pad. But more meaningful than their attention was the connection she felt with the broader audience, the regular people who had come simply to hear new music, who had no idea who she was or where she had come from. They were with her, nodding at certain lines, their expressions reflecting the emotional journey of her lyrics. For her final song, Lily set aside the guitar. This was her newest piece, one she had finished just a week ago. It was called $1 to Spare, and it told the story of her encounter with Hopkins, though without naming him directly. It spoke of unexpected kindness, of being truly seen after years of invisibility, of the slow, painful process of learning to trust and to hope again. As she sang, her eyes found Hopkins in the audience. His expression was one of quiet pride, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Elena was openly weeping, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. Marcus watched with a broad smile, his head nodding in time with the music. "You asked why $1. When most just looked away, you saw through my walls. To the words I couldn't say, one chance meeting, one moment of grace, one hand extended. In this cold, lonely place, and now I'm learning what it means to be seen, to step from the shadows into a life I never dreamed." The bridge of the song shifted to a minor key, acknowledging the ongoing struggle, the doubt that still sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. "Some nights I still run, some days I still hide. The old fears don't vanish, they just quiet down inside." But the final chorus returned to a hopeful major key, a testament to how far she had come. "But you gave more than money. You gave me back my voice, reminded me that living can be more than just a choice. So if you ask what I needed, when I had nothing to my name, it wasn't just $1 but someone who believed just the same." As the final note hung in the air, Lily felt something she had never experienced before, a sense of completeness, of having communicated exactly what she meant to say, without filter or fear. For the first time in her life, she had been fully seen and heard. The audience rose to their feet, applause washing over her like a wave, a standing ovation. Lily stood, momentarily overwhelmed by the response. Her eyes swept the room, taking in the faces of these strangers who had connected with her story, who had allowed themselves to be moved by her truth. In that moment, something shifted within her. Not a dramatic transformation, but the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. She didn't feel like an imposter anymore. She didn't feel like a fraud or a charity case or a project. She felt like an artist. As the applause continued, Lily took a small bow, her eyes finding Hopkins once more. The expression that passed between them contained volumes: gratitude, pride, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of the journey they had taken together. After the performance, the small backstage area filled with people, offering congratulations. Daniel Gray introduced her to the industry representatives, who spoke of potential and authenticity, and a unique voice. They handed her business cards with important-sounding titles and asked about her plans for the future. Lily accepted their cards politely but without the desperate gratitude they might have expected. Something fundamental had changed during her performance. She now understood that while their validation was nice, it wasn't what defined her worth. She had already proven herself to the only person who ultimately mattered: herself. When the industry people finally departed, promising to be in touch, Lily found herself surrounded by the people who had become her unlikely family: Hopkins, Elena, Marcus, and even Gray, whose initial skepticism had long since transformed into genuine support. "Did you see their faces when you hit that high note in Invisible Girl?" Marcus grinned. "That's the real thing, kid. Can't fake that kind of connection." Elena hugged her tightly. "So proud of you, Nina. So very proud." Gray, ever the professional, was already thinking ahead. "We should get you back in the studio next week. Strike while the iron's hot." Those Meridian Records people were very interested, but it was Hopkins who noticed Lily's slight overwhelm at the flurry of attention and suggestions. "Perhaps we could give Lily a moment to breathe," he suggested gently. "Tonight was a significant milestone. There will be time for planning tomorrow." Grateful for his perception, Lily nodded. "I just need a minute," she admitted. The others took the hint, moving toward the small reception area where drinks and light refreshments awaited. Hopkins turned to follow them, but Lily caught his arm. "Would you stay, just for a moment?" When they were alone, Lily found herself at a loss for words. Ironic for someone who had just moved an audience with her lyrics. How could she possibly express what his belief in her had meant? How could she articulate the magnitude of the change in her life since that rainy afternoon when she had asked him for $1? In the end, she simply stepped forward and embraced him. Hopkins returned the hug gently, the gesture conveying what words could not. "I never needed $1, Lily whispered. "I just needed someone to believe in me." When they pulled apart, Hopkins smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "And now the world will," he said simply. Later that night, after the celebration had wound down, Lily stood alone outside the Blue Note. The street was quiet now, the city settling into its late-night rhythm. A gentle rain had begun to fall, reminding her of that first day at Elena's café. In just 3 months, her life had transformed completely, from sleeping in shelters and doorways to having her own apartment, from hiding her words in a tattered notebook to sharing them with a room full of strangers who had risen to their feet in appreciation, from invisibility to being truly seen. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. There would be new challenges ahead, new doubts to overcome, new heights to reach for. But for the first time, Lily faced the future not with fear but with a tentative confidence that whatever came next, she would find a way through it. As she zipped up her jacket against the light rain, Lily noticed a young woman huddled in a doorway across the street, thin, wary-eyed, clutching a backpack that probably contained everything she owned. For a moment their eyes met, a flash of recognition passing between them. Without hesitation, Lily crossed the street. The girl stiffened as she approached, the wariness of the street hardened evident in her posture. "Hey," Lily said softly. I'm Lily, the girl nodded cautiously. Maya. I know it's raining, Lily continued. There's a cafe around the corner that stays open late. The owner, Elena, she's good people. She'll let you sit inside, maybe get something warm to drink. Maya studied her, suspicion warring with need. Why are you telling me this? Lily smiled, understanding the question beneath the question. Why are you helping me? What do you want, in return? Because someone once saw me when I was invisible, she replied simply. And it changed everything. She reached into her pocket and pulled out some bills. Not just $1, but enough for a hot meal and a safe place for the night. If you go to Elena's, tell her Lily sent you. She'll understand. Maya hesitated, then accepted the money with a nod of thanks. As Lily walked away, she glanced back once to see Maya heading in the direction of Elena's cafe. She couldn't know if this small act would make any difference in the girl's life. Perhaps Maya would use the money for food and shelter. Perhaps not. Perhaps she would find her way to Elena's cafe. Or perhaps she would disappear back into the invisible margins of the city. But that wasn't the point. The point was extending a hand, acknowledging another human being's existence and worth. The point was passing on the simple, profound gift that Hopkins had given her, the gift of being seen. A few blocks away, Lily passed a small hotel where she knew Hopkins was staying. Light still shone from his window, the dedicated night owl, probably reading scripts or making notes for his next project. She smiled, sending a silent thank you upward to that window, from asking for $1 to giving dollars away. From hiding her voice to sharing it with the world. From surviving to beginning at last, to truly live. As she continued toward her apartment, a place that finally felt like home, Lily began to softly sing a new melody, the beginnings of a new song already, taking shape in her mind. Her voice carried clearly through the rain-washed streets, no longer confined to whispers and hidden notebooks, but offered freely to a world that, she was learning, was sometimes willing to listen if you found the courage to speak. And in a city, full of light and shadow, of visible and invisible lives, of connections made and missed, her voice was one more thread in the complex tapestry of human experience, unique, valuable, and finally, irrevocably, heard. In his hotel room, Hopkins stood by the window, watching the rain create patterns on the glass. The evening had been everything he had hoped for Lily, a chance to share her extraordinary gift, to connect with an audience, to be recognized for her talent rather than defined by her circumstances. But more than the industry attention or the standing ovation, what moved him most was the change he had witnessed in Lily herself. The transformation wasn't just in her improved appearance or her developing artistic skills. It was in her eyes, the way she now met the world's gaze directly, neither defiant nor fearful, but simply present and authentic. Hopkins had lived a life filled with accolades and achievements. He had stood on the world's greatest stages, worked with legendary directors, brought characters to life that would endure beyond his own time. But few things in his long career had given him the profound satisfaction he felt tonight. Because in the end, his role in Lily's journey had been a simple one. He hadn't saved her. He hadn't fixed her. He had merely recognized what was already there, a brilliant mind, a resilient spirit, an authentic voice, and helped create the conditions for those qualities to flourish. The real work, the hard work, of confronting fear and doubt, of choosing hope over despair, of transforming pain into art, that had been Lily's alone. All he had done was believe in her until she could believe in herself. As Hopkins turned away from the window, he thought of a line from one of his favorite plays. What is the city but the people? The true magic of human existence, he reflected, wasn't in buildings or institutions or systems. It was in these moments of genuine connection, when one soul recognized another across the vast divide of circumstance and experience. In a world that often felt increasingly fragmented and isolated, perhaps that was the most important work of all, to truly see each other, to extend a hand across the divides, to believe in the potential that lies dormant in every human heart, waiting only for the right conditions to bloom. With that thought, Anthony Hopkins turned out the light, content in the knowledge that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness could set in motion ripples that continued long after the initial stone had been cast. And while Lily's journey was only beginning, he had no doubt that those ripples would continue to spread, touching lives he would never know in ways he could not imagine. All because, on a rainy afternoon in Los Angeles, he had paused to truly see a girl whom others had passed by, and in doing so had reminded her that she had always been worthy of being seen. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe, it would mean a lot.